everybody. We are excited today for the third panel discussion in our symposium week of virtual programming. The overall theme of the symposium is depolarization, seeking common ground. And we are super excited to have this panel today sponsored by FIRE. They've been just a wonderful partner, and big thanks to Joe Cohn for helping organize and probably twisting some of your arms to join us today. So we're always, it's always just a pleasure to work alongside Joe. And of course, Peter, we were commenting, it's been a while since we saw each other in Philadelphia, probably too long, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And so we're super excited to welcome him back. Of course, thank you to our audience. We are always grateful for the folks who join us and interact with us. We try to make our programming very interactive. We will drop some of the information in the chat function as we get going to let you know how to interact, how to ask questions. We're also grateful for our volunteers who enable us to do this on the tech support side, and the other volunteers, and then of course our members who are the lifeblood of our organization. I do want to mention some programming that will continue on throughout the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have a full plate. We've got a panel discussion on the role of immigrant voices in depolarization, and another panel on the role of the media in depolarization. And then later on in the evening, we will have a VIP reception, and all of our speakers and sponsors are welcome to join us for that. We'll be doing an off-the-record discussion on the recent Afghanistan evacuation and some of the work that a coalition of nonprofits and others have been doing to help find safe passage for Afghans. And I'll be joining a couple of my colleagues who have been on the steering committee of that coalition to give that discussion. We'll also feature the Afghan National Symphony as part of that program. If you know folks who wanted to be here for this discussion but were unable to join us live because of the timing, don't worry. It will be up on our YouTube channel, possibly this evening, but definitely within the next 24 hours. And you can just subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to get notified when programs pop up, and you'll be able to see it. And I know Sydney is dropping some of the links in there into the chat function. So I want to introduce Peter Bonilla from FIRE, the Foundation on Individual Rights and Education. I am super grateful you're here today to lead this conversation, Peter, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, all right, Steve, thank you. I'm on? Yes, I'm on. Well, I will very briefly introduce myself before getting right into it with our panelists, who I'm gonna let introduce themselves. My name is Peter Bnia. I'm Vice President of Programs at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is based in Philadelphia. I have been at the organization for 13 years, so I have worked in a lot of its various program areas. Among the key, the key aspects of FIRE's work, one of them is the defense of student and faculty rights, individual liberties on their campuses. That's probably where we get the most visibility in our work when we are publicly advocating for the rights of a student or faculty member being censored or punished at their institution. But apart from our defense work, which also includes a fair amount of legal advocacy and sometimes litigation, which we also engage in a little bit of. Another major part of FIRE's work, which I think kind of gets to closer to the heart of why we're here today and sort of the mission for this panel. A big part of our work is education and outreach. When it comes to things like putting on conferences for students and faculty, putting out publications and guides for students on various aspects of their rights on campus, free speech, due process, religious liberty, things like that. We've in recent years undertaken, significantly stepped up the extent of our in-house research on various aspects of campus free speech, including surveying students on their attitudes towards various issues of free expression. We just yesterday published a new ranking evaluating the climates for free expression at, I think it's 155 campuses around the country. And that sort of, in the time that I have been at FIRE, I have watched, campus free expression go from being a very niche issue that had trouble, getting much visibility and trouble getting room in the press and things like that, to watching it become, not only a much more prominent national issue, but also sort of in a lot of ways, sort of a proxy for bigger cultural battles and bigger flashpoints of polarization around the country. Our mission isn't specifically to do with depolarizing the academy or depolarizing the electorate, but it's definitely something that we have a strong interest in terms of trying to build more tolerance towards a more open culture of free expression, making the case that benefits all persons in the campus environment. And so, it's a question that we regularly grapple with, and that we are, always looking for new ways to innovate on. So I'm very happy to have our three panelists with us today. And what I'm going to do first, Robbie, I'm going to start with you, and then go to Amna, and then go to Jacki. If you could each just briefly introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of your background, and then, this is a purposefully open-ended question. Maybe talk about, give your sense of the issue of polarization on campus, or, as you see it, whether, in your capacity as a student, in your capacity as faculty, in your capacity as an education professional with a heavy academic background. And from there, we will dive right into the meat of this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Peter. I really appreciate it. Before I jump in and respond, I'll introduce myself briefly. Like was mentioned, my name is Robby Fensom, and I'm a current undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Some of my academic interests are in philosophy and the rhetoric surrounding free speech issues. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. This is something that I'm just so impressed with the work being done. I want to thank the other members of the panel and the First Amendment Voice. Much of my personal interest in this subject is a direct result of the work being done by the organizations represented here. I guess diving into a little bit about me, I have the pleasure of serving as my institution's current student body president, as well as a member of our board of trustees. In those roles, I consider it my duty and obligation to represent all of our students. A portion of that is students who disagree with me. And this topic of polarization is deeply important to that, because in my capacity as a student leader, I can't represent their interests if I don't talk to them, if I don't engage with them, for whatever reason, if they won't engage with me. So I guess on the topic of polarization and finding common ground, I view it as very much a necessity if we're going to do our jobs and obligations as leaders, as citizens, if we're going to do it well. I can leave a little bit more to the other panelists to discuss their thoughts, but one of the things I've noticed in my personal life is that it's become harder and harder to be friends with the people we disagree with. And I would, maybe at the surface level, that's one of the most problematic aspects, is that it's become less cool to be friends with people that disagree with you. It's a little bit stigmatized, and it's definitely something that I'm deeply concerned with. And I guess I can leave my introductory remarks there.
Great, nice to meet you. I'm Amna Khalid, and I'm a professor of history at Carleton College. I've been interested in the state of higher education for a few years now. I've been following the conversation, and especially the issue of intellectual freedom and the ability to speak freely on campus. In terms of how I see polarization in my day-to-day work on my own campus, it manifests as one side being shut down. We have a predominantly liberal campus. The ethos is liberal, such that conservatives do not feel at ease here. and they're unable to speak up in class. I'll have them come to my office hours and tell me privately that they hold certain views or that they appreciated that I brought up a different point of view in the classroom, but they're unable to share that in the classroom space itself. So that's how I'm seeing polarization manifest on my own campus. I'm also seeing it manifesting in like the broader kind of cultural setting like we all are. On the left, I think one of the manifestations is what we see as cancel culture, and on the right, it's censorship. And in fact, I'm hosting a new podcast called Banished, which looks at exactly those issues. And I bring a historical lens to bear upon it. So I'll leave my introductory remarks there and let Jackie introduce herself.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to start by thanking First Amendment Voice and Fire for the opportunity to be part of the panel today. And I'm delighted to be with Amna and Robbie and Peter here today. Thank you all very much. So I am Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill. I'm the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Campus Free Expression Project. The Bipartisan Policy Center is actually the only organization registered in the District of Columbia that has the word bipartisan in its name. And this is certainly a moment where it's very hard to be bipartisan, to have conversations across difference. And that's why we have a free expression project, because we know that colleges and universities, certainly they have an academic mission to advance the frontiers of knowledge and to teach students, but they also have a civic mission to prepare the next generation for citizenship and civic leadership. And so that is why we're concerned about the ability to have conversations across difference in college campuses. It's a healthy sign of a robust civil society and pluralistic democracy that people have a wide range of views. But we do see, not only in our broader society, but on college campuses, what political scientists call effective polarization. The idea that people who are on the other side aren't just people with a different opinion, but they're actually bad people, and they have divisive stereotypes about one another. One way that manifests is exactly on this question of friendship that Robbie mentioned. A flagship public university, very much to their credit, did a survey and published it, looking at their students' attitudes on free expression. And almost a quarter of liberal-leaning students said that they wouldn't have a conservative as a friend. Conservative students in smaller numbers said they wouldn't have as a liberal as a friend. And if we can't have people learn to be friends on college campuses, it doesn't augur well for the future of our democracy.
Great, thank you all very much for those terrific introductions. Something I should have said for those joining us, we're gonna try to keep at least half of this session for question and answer from the audience. And you can, if you look at the Q&A pop up at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to enter your questions in there anytime you want, and we will be able to get to them during the question and answer session. Jackie, I'm gonna stick with you for the moment, since you are the last person to give your intro, and this is something I was wondering about the Bipartisan Policy Center, because your Campus Free Expression Initiative, it's one of the newer projects at Bipartisan Policy. And if you look at your other policy areas, they're pretty vast and all encompassing. Energy, technology, immigration, healthcare, big things that require big solutions, and people really coming together and putting their brains together to make forward progress on this. And then I don't like to downplay the work that I've done for the last 13 years, but Campus Free Expression, in the company of the Bipartisan Policy Center's other areas of interest, it's much more of a niche area. Could you maybe talk a little bit about we'll talk about your work with the Campus Free Expression Project, but also if you can give a sense of why the Bipartisan Policy Center thought it was particularly valuable to branch out into this area.
Sure, I'm delighted to have a chance to speak to that. So, as you mentioned, the Bipartisan Policy Center has a very broad portfolio of policy projects. And a lot of the work that we do there is to bring people together in working groups and task forces to, bipartisan groups to make policy recommendations that we share with Capitol Hill or with state houses. So the Campus Free Expression Project is rather different because we're a campus-facing project. But we don't see this project as a niche project, but truly a foundational project. The ability of people to have conversations across difference, to work constructively with those with whom they have principled disagreement is really essential to the health of our democracy. So the board and leaders of the Bipartisan Policy Center, knowing how important this is to the future of the democracy in our country, decided they want to make an investment in supporting colleges and universities and creating robust policies that foster a welcoming, safe environment for robust intellectual exchange on campuses.
Well, I definitely think that's a very important area to be in. For no other reason, the students in our colleges today are going to be writing, are going to be, our elected officials and other, thought leaders, in any number of areas, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. So yes, I definitely think it's important that we get those lessons in now, that we instill those values now. So, so thank you. I'm gonna, we'll come back to the Bipartisan Policy Center's work because I'm excited to hear more about the task force that you've been working on for most of the last year and what you've taken away from it so far. But I'm gonna ask Robbie the next question. And Robbie, we had the pleasure of having Robbie as one of our undergraduate interns this summer. And it's it's great to have that connection, and also for Robbie to have taken the position that he has now as a student body president of UNC Wilmington student government, and his role as a student trustee in that capacity. Robbie, could you this has been issues of free expression are something that are clearly very important to you. Did they play a significant role in why you got involved in student government in the first place?
I'm going to answer in a way that I probably shouldn't have, which is not really.
That's
there's
fine.
a lot of other issues that I care deeply about, and those were the ones that really funneled my interest into student government. There's actually kind of from the direction of being involved in student government that I learned further about the importance of free speech issues. Kind of on the topic of building coalitions that Jacki was talking about, I think that's one of the things I'm particularly thankful for, is that our student government is made up of people who profoundly disagree with some of my takes on First Amendment issues, but there's other areas that we can find a lot of agreement in, and that's one of the most exciting things. I would credit most of my interest in free speech issues really to my academic interests and the professors who've poured into me. I'm very lucky to have, in particular, a professor, Dr. Donna Habibi at UNCW, whose particular interest is J.S. Mill. And so we spent a lot of time talking about On Liberty in his class. And that right there was the real spark.
Great. And maybe, maybe could you give us an example of, it doesn't have to, not free expression related necessarily, but, like a time that you were able to bring differing perspectives together to get things done in UNC student government? Are there any initiatives, any resolutions, things like that you're particularly proud of?
The first one that comes to mind, and there's probably a dozen that will come later on. The first one that comes to mind was a project that came up my sophomore year, so about 2 years ago, which was related to campus hunger, which if you keep up with issues in higher education, is one that pops up fairly often, is student access to food, to healthy food that meets their dietary needs. And at UNCW, that was one that we had a particular interest based on our demographics. And was able to bring it together various campus departments, including our Office of Student Leadership and Engagement. They took a particular interest in that, as well as student government and a couple of our campus dining officers as well. And one of the things that was helpful is as far as this particular issue, which is something that is fairly uncontroversial. It's something that most people would consider important, but was interesting to me is people's reasons for why they thought it was important. When I was talking to some student senators, what came to mind was that they were purchasing meal plans and that they wanted more autonomy over what they did with their meal plan. So being able to donate to other students was important to them because to them that allowed them to have more ownership of that program. Other students were motivated by other reasons, such as their own experiences with dealing with food insecurity as well. Peter, does that answer the question fairly well?
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Thank you. That's a great example. I'm gonna bring the next question over to you. I think we've known each other a handful of years now. We first connected when we had you at our academic conference back in 2018, and we're going to see you there again this year. God willing that this new COVID variant doesn't come and wash and collapse the entire house of cards on itself. I knew you first through your writing on a variety of campus expression issues and writing really about the a lot of the issues that that have proven polarizing in higher education in recent years. Things like trigger warnings, the current emphasis on diversity initiatives, diversity related education, the whole controversy over critical race theory, which we haven't been able to escape this year. That's how I knew you first in kind of that capacity as someone as a more general observer and commentator on higher education. Can you talk a little bit more? You went into it a little in your introduction, but could you talk a little bit more about just how you became more interested in those aspects of higher education and how and how you kind of found it valuable to offer kind of public opinion on the issues?
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. To kind of preface this conversation, I'd like to kind of tell you a little bit about my background, which is that I come from Pakistan, which is where I grew up, and I did my undergraduate work there. And I subsequently went to Britain for my graduate work, and then via South Africa ended up in the US. And the reason I tell you that is that there was a very specific reason why I chose to leave my home country and come to what, in my mind, broadly speaking, was the West. I came of age during the Salman Rushdie era, when Salman Rushdie's satanic verses was pilloried. There was a fatwa against it, and people were killing each other over it. And many of the riots were taking place just miles from my house. And I remember at that point, I was a young girl, watching things unfold on TV and thinking, wow, the West, the way it stood up for the freedom of expression was inspirational for someone like me. Now, bear in mind that I am talking about Pakistan, where there are many, many constraints on speech. And as I grew older, actually, I had the chance to come abroad for my undergraduate work, but I didn't feel ready. I came and visited, and I decided, no, I want to still be in Pakistan. And I somehow hoped that in a private college in Pakistan, I would have the freedom of expression that I was kind of hankering after, and I wasn't yet ready to leave home. But lo and behold, that wasn't the case. I found myself stymied at every stage when I wanted to have an open and frank conversation about controversial issues. So at that point, I made the decision that I need for my intellectual freedom to move elsewhere and pursue my intellectual interests elsewhere. And that's what informed my moved to England and then subsequently to the US. And, when I got here and I got this job at a small liberal arts college, I thought, wow, this is heaven. I have landed and this is what I've always dreamt of. And, it was a couple of years into my work here, I started hearing about bias response teams. That's how when it first kind of started registering on my mindscape, and I was like, well, what is this? And our college had a town hall, there was a proposal for it. And I remember just going with my colleagues, sitting there and being horrified. As I sat there, the hair on the back of my neck literally stood up. And I thought, wow, this is a different kind of speech police and thought police that is entering the very space that is supposed to be a place for free ideas and for inquiry. And that was the beginning of my kind of paying attention to what's happening. At that point, I was still naive enough to think that this was something that was particular to my campus. And I started working on a little piece with my colleague, Jeff Snyder. And as we started digging further, I was absolutely gobsmacked to see that this is far more pervasive. It's happening across the country. And, you know, bear in mind, I'm still pretty fresh off the boat, so to speak, in that I was learning about the American higher ed landscape. And this was a huge shock. And then once I turned the page over there, you know, then along came trigger warnings and along came all these other ways. And it was deeply disturbing to me that in the name of progressive values, the outcome was a silencing that was taking place on campus and a narrowing of the space for disagreement, which frankly is the heart of learning. So that's my interest. That's how I got involved in these conversations.
Great. Something I realized, you know, as I've been going through and asking the questions of our panelists one by one. This is, you know, to all of our panelists. You know, this I want to be a pretty, you know, free flowing discussion. We'll be taking, you know, questions from the audience as they come, but also if panelists, if you find yourself with questions for the other panelists or are curious to have them expound more on certain aspects of their experience, I want you to feel free to do that as well. I don't need to be the gatekeeper of all questions here. Yeah, I'm curious, you know, you've been writing about this for a few years. Are there you know, areas where you found your thinking has evolved, or, you know, any areas where you've seen, you know, where you've seen positive progress, or, you know, signs for hope or optimism?
Wow, that's a big question. It's a hard one. I kind of want to say no. I've actually, it's been a series of disillusionment after disillusionment, and I'm not sitting in a place where I feel particularly hopeful in terms of the trends that I've seen. Having said that, I feel what's heartening to me is that more people are speaking up and taking the space. So that would be where I see a little bit of hope. And that's in part why I have also started speaking about these issues more publicly. But at this point, I take a lot of strength from knowing that FIRE is there, Heterodox Academy is there, Bipartisan Policy Center is there. So you know, organizations like these are inspiring, but they're also indicative of a deeper need to address these questions. And we have more and more of these coming up. You have the Academic Freedom Alliance. So while I take heart in that, it's also indicative of how dire the situation is.
Sure. You know, you talked, I think it was in your introduction, you talked about how, you know, one of the areas that, you know, that you've seen this polarization manifest is in self-censorship among students in class. And this is kind of both for Robbie and for you also, Amna. Maybe Robbie first. Could you talk a little bit more, you know, is self-censorship among the student population, whether in class, in, you know, in the general discourse, you know, and you know, hanging out with friends, you know, is that something that that you've seen at UNC Wilmington to the point where you think it's an ongoing issue?
Definitely, several things come to mind. So forgive any ramble. One is that I think UNCW does a lot of these issues really, really well, benchmarked to some of our peers. Anecdotally, I can think about how I feel comfortable in class voicing some opinions, and how professors have tried to make it very clear to their students in classrooms that diverse viewpoints will be respected in the class, that they'll be engaged with. So to some extent, I think I'm very blessed to attend the institution that I do. Even up through our administration, that they care about these issues. I'm very thankful for our Dean of Students, Dr. Walker, who has been someone who's taken an interest in these issues. We go out to lunch frequently and talk about the importance of First Amendment rights. And so in some ways, I think my insight is a little bit limited in that sense. I can offer that in talking to some other peers that they don't always share that. To some extent, I'm also probably a little bit more confident than some of my peers. What I will offer though is where I was as a freshman. And as a freshman, I can think about coming to grips with some of my identities, who I am as a person, and kind of feeling I was being placed in certain blocks socially that I, as someone who identifies as gay, was expected to have certain political opinions, and that it was a little bit hard for me in certain spaces to disagree with other people. A lot of that was self-imposed, and I think that's maybe one of the dangers with self-censorship is it's hard to see the full extent of it. It wasn't someone pinning me down saying you can't voice that opinion. It was more I'm worried about what other people will think of me and whether I will be able to make the same friends that if I was silent, that I would be able to make. I'm not sure what your perspective is there.
I think you're hitting on something really important, which is, the self-censorship that we're talking about it's one of those things that is hidden. And I'm grateful for the kind of work that FIRE and Real Clear Education, et cetera, are doing in terms of their surveys to find out. But even so, even with those surveys, there's so much of the self-censorship is hidden. And I find it happening in my classrooms a lot. I find that students are reluctant to voice unpopular viewpoints. And it's not really coming from the professors, the kind of sanction. The sanction is coming from their peers. Now, this is a problem, and this is why campus culture matters so much. So if I may, I'd like to share one of the strategies that I've decided to use in class this term. And it's an experiment, so we'll see. But on the first day of class, I said, I'm really not interested in you telegraphing to me in this classroom what you believe. In fact, the game is I should never really know what you truly think. I want you to don different hats. So I need to be perpetually confused about what your point of view is. And so each student must, as we engage in these questions, occasionally don a different hat without me knowing, so that we can have the freedom to put ideas out there without them being associated with our person. I think that is where the social sanction comes in. And I'm trying to see if this will work as a strategy to distance ourselves. I'll report back at the end of term. We've just started teaching last week. So
can I interject real quick? Oh,
please.
Sorry, Jackie. It looked like you were about to go.
Robbie, you first. You're the one on campus, and then maybe I'll come in.
Sounds great. Thank you. Amna, that right there sounds like you would be my absolute favorite professor. That sounds like a thrilling class to be in and a lot of fun. One of the things that came to mind too, though, when you were talking is another kind of pervasive problem with self-censorship is that I think I can ask, and well, I have asked students in the past whether they are self-censoring, and even that language, a lot of them respond that they're not self-censoring. But then you ask follow-up questions of like, oh, but do you do this? Do you feel consistently that it's permissible for you to voice something that's unpopular? And then that's where you get affirmative. And so it's kind of funny that even the language around it, it sounds so scary, self-censorship, but you have to kind of break it down sometimes.
If I can jump in now, I just want to add 3 pieces to this question of self-censorship. I see that Heather Miska in the Q&A is already asking about social media. I think social media is a key part of self-censorship. The Knight Gallup most recent survey found that 58% of students say that most discussion of social and political ideas takes place on social media, even though only 29% of them say that such discussion is civil. And in the public flagship university that I cited already, about 2 in 5 conservatives and 1 in 10 liberals said that they were worried not just about their general comments in the quad or in the dorm room, but their classroom comments being reported on social media, and that chills the classroom conversation. Second, there is a fear of this kind of censorious minority, and I think it is a small minority that makes people afraid, whether it's going to be on social media or elsewhere, to be called out. And that is one of the factors that contributes to self-censorship. But I think third, there's also, Heterodox Academy brought out a survey late last year showing that people are more reluctant to speak out when they are in the majority or the perceived position of privilege. So straight students, for example, are more reluctant to speak when there's issues of sexuality and gender being discussed.
Jackie, could you, we'll see how you're coming through, but could you maybe talk some about, your Campus Free Expression Task Force?
Sure, I'm just delighted to do so. So the Bipartisan Policy Center has assembled its academic leaders task force on campus free expression. We have a distinguished group of college presidents, a 2020 college alumnus, a faculty member, a former trustee and community leader. And we are going to be issuing our report later this year. I think this task force group has really been concerned with why it's become more difficult to have conversations across difference in college campuses. And we are very much focused on the question of how is it that you have a campus that honors its commitments to diversity and inclusion, and also honors its commitments to freedom of expression. We know that 76% of students say that commitments to diversity and inclusion frequently or occasionally come into conflict with free speech rights. And the truth is, both of those commitments are essential to a healthy campus community. And so we are going to be issuing a series of findings and recommendations about how campuses can create a respectful environment for all and really equip students with the skills and the capacities to cultivate the virtues of skepticism, to be thinking, am I really right? Is there something else that I should be thinking about? To be thinking about the virtues of civic courage, that I have the courage and confidence to challenge ideas with which I disagree, and also the virtue of resilience, that I am able to hear ideas with which I disagree, give them a hearing, know that giving them a hearing does not mean endorsement. And we think that campuses that cultivate those virtues of resilience, skepticism, and civic courage are ones that are going to prepare students for citizenship, civic leadership, and to be independent thinkers.
Can I just jump in over here and pick up some of the threads and say something, Peter?
Please, absolutely.
So I'm delighted by what you're outlining, Jackie, and I'm looking forward to reading the report. But to address the question, I wanted to go back to the social media question that Heather put in the chat. And I think that's a very good question. And it's one that I've been thinking about. Of course, we all know that social media lends itself to becoming echo chambers because of the algorithms. But, to my mind, just to be provocative for a little bit, polarization isn't the problem. I don't think polarization in itself is the issue. The issue is that the space for conversation between those who are polarized is being narrowed. So I would like to talk a little bit about social media has a lot to do with that. And it has a lot to do with that because of the ways in which social media encourages people to interact. It's very tempting to immediately have a jibe when someone takes a stab at you, and you see that behavior degenerate into the recesses of human capacity for interacting very rapidly. And one of the things that I've decided, and I think many of us are very skeptical about social media and what it does, and we've stayed away from it, including myself. I'm responsible too. But in March, I decided to join Twitter, and part of it is also, I want to, insofar as possible, reclaim that space to model a different kind of engagement. And I think it is upon us to do that. So the more we can do it, the more we can at least start opening the space for conversation across different points of view. And I'm not just talking about political points of view. I'm talking about different points of view, period.
Can I ask you a quick question there? Amna, that's something I think is very admirable, is entering spaces and trying to set a new standard there, kind of within the confines of both social media and in person as well. I guess, what do you do when you encounter people who completely disagree with even trying to reach across the aisle and trying to engage with people who just have no interest in doing that, and maybe are either being apathetic or vicious towards you? Like, what's your response?
So this is a good question because it was just a few days ago that I had a whole series of such interactions in response to a piece that my colleague and I wrote about trigger warnings. And like many issues, it's remarkable to me how many issues are a left-right issue in the US. You could you pick up the color of your phone is a left-right issue over here and people want to tag you. So the response in certain circles on Twitter was vicious and was pretty nasty. And some of those I engaged with in good faith. And I can tell you, I'm not there's nothing inherently nice about me. I also want to kind of, when someone takes a punch at you, you have the temptation. But the first thing is to kind of hold back. It's like, no, take a deep breath. I'm not going to respond. I have engaged, and some of those have yielded some good conversations, right? And have made me think. I'm like, oh, this is an interesting point. I want to consider this further. Some of them have not. In fact, the majority of them haven't. I've tried, and after a little point, when I realize I'm not making progress, I'm not making progress. And the fact of the matter is, you've got to give up. I'm not going to go down the route of name calling and descending into that kind of conversation. So that too is part of the modeling, is when do you know to stop? You cannot convince everyone, and you cannot engage productively with everyone, and that too is okay. We've got to take that with a grain of salt.
Robert, I'm gonna bring this next one over to you. In terms of sort of creating productive spaces for discourse and dialogue, I know you were recently just at a new conference that FIRE did. Am I correct about that? Yeah,
yes.
we've literally just launched a new initiative called Let's Talk, which I, as a senior FIRE staffer, am gonna put myself in the awkward position of having you explain to me, because I've been busy with a number of other things, so I've kind of watched it take shape from a distance. But you were recently at our first conference organized around those principles. So could you maybe talk a little about that experience and maybe what others might be able to take from it?
Absolutely. I'm super excited about this initiative that FIRE is putting forward. Like Peter mentioned, it's called Let's Talk, but there's a lot of, versatility for what that can look like. The goal of it is to create additional spaces on college campuses for students to have difficult conversations, ideally with people who fundamentally disagree with them. I think it was built out of an observation that a lot of these conversations that used to be having, say, in your dorm room, with your roommate, with your floor, that they're not happening in the same way. And then in response, we need to be very intentional about creating them. So the conference was focused on that. It's actually really neat. We were able to meet with people from all over the country and talk about their experiences with polarization, with self-censorship. So it was nice to be in a space there. What I will say, Peter, and to anyone listening, is that I'm very excited about this program. I'm looking forward to bringing it in some capacity to my campus, because we currently don't have any organization with the specific goal of having, civil dialogue with other people. I know, even from my personal friends and my experiences, I actively seek out people who disagree with me, but still my closest friends are going to always be the people who feel familiar with me. It's something very human about, looking for people with similarities to you. So with the goal of creating, difficult conversations, I'm looking forward to that. They gave us a lot of interesting topics to bring up, at the get-go. So the goal is to have conversations around abortion eventually. And one of the assets of the program is that it gives you building blocks, because it's not easy to jump into a space with strangers and discuss the fundamental issues at play when we're talking about big issues like abortion. And building up a skill. I think, Jacki, you actually had a piece a couple of years ago with the Bipartisan Policy Center, where you're talking about the skills necessary for engaging with people. A lot of these same principles are at play here.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And a key focus of the task force recommendations is how is it we build up skills, recognizing that it's actually, Generation Z faces challenges that previous generations didn't. We've already mentioned social media. people today are growing up in more homogenized neighborhoods than I did a generation ago. So you grew up knowing fewer people in your school, your clubs, whose news sources, whose backgrounds, whose families' politics are different from your own, so you have less experience kind of talking with people who are different from you. And so those things make it harder when you arrive on college campus, which might be the most diverse environment where you'll ever be, to jump into having those kinds of conversations. So I think focusing on that skill building, beginning with freshman orientation, and building these free expression capacity, skill building, conversation across different programs into freshman orientation, and all first year programming will be a key task force recommendation in our task force report. I think is really important, because it's not something that people will necessarily have when they arrive on college campus. You need to build those skills.
We're coming at this from the perspective of what students can do, how students can create those spaces. Jacki, can you, and you can probably talk a little about this, from your work with the committee and from your work with, higher education leaders and trustees, and you were, previously, I think before you came to Bipartisan Policy Center, you were at ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, so you approached the work from that area as well. But in terms of setting expectations and sort of influencing the overall culture of the campus, can you talk a little bit about your views on the higher education leaders role, like how how a campus president factors into that?
Yeah. I think from the trustees to the president and the leadership team, to athletic coaches, the professors, and students too as leaders, there are leadership roles across the college campus, and in some sense, faculty members are the ones who are the most important, because they're the ones in the classroom creating the guidelines and guardrails that teach those conversations across difference. But I do think presidents and their leadership teams are really essential to setting a free campus culture. They're the ones, speakers, and they're modeling of how they engage with those across difference, set the example for the entire campus. They set the policies, programs that help backstop controversial expression on a college campus, and through their actions and words, model that for the campus community. And it's so important for people to see that leadership at the top, because that's what helps everyone else understand that this campus is open to open inquiry, difficult conversations, and giving even very controversial views a hearing, knowing that giving somebody a hearing, it doesn't mean that you endorse their views.
Amna, could you maybe talk about that from the perspective of the faculty, how you see how you see the faculty role? And I agree with I agree with Jacki. I think that in terms of the pillars of the campus community, if you look at the students, you look at the administration, you look at the faculty, a lot of the time it is kind of the faculty that are sort of the guardians of free speech and academic freedom, because they spend time with the students, they help set that kind of culture day in and day out, or they don't, or they fail at doing it quite a lot of the time, probably. Amna, could you talk maybe about how you see that role for the faculty?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the role of the faculty is, of course, critical. We're interacting with students. In many ways, we're on the front lines in classrooms. It is imperative that we model for them not only the importance of free expression and open conversation, but also how to disagree constructively. I think that's something that is lacking on many campuses, where faculty are disagreeing and modeling how constructive disagreement is done. But I want to push back a little bit and say even more than faculty, I think there is another cadre of individuals on campus who are facing students more, and those are people in student life. So the Dean of Students office actually has a far more direct way of accessing students. And arguably, some people have argued, and I think there's some truth in this, that there's almost an alternative curriculum there that is being taught. So I really like the way, Jackie, that you're saying the emphasis is on freshman and new student orientation. Those are key spaces where some of these skills and ideas need to be taught. I really like the fact that FIRE has a First Amendment kind of education tool to be used in New Student Week. So faculty are important for sure. I think Dean of Students offices are becoming increasingly important with the increase in administrative positions, particularly in that department on campus. I think those are pretty crucial. And I cannot emphasize enough what Jackie already says, that, you know, the modeling begins right at the top. Presidents and leaders in higher ed need to show that they have a backbone when it comes to these issues. And they need to stand up for their faculty, for their students, for their staff when it comes to extramural speech, when it comes to other kinds of speech, because that is what signals to the world that we're a campus where we are going to tolerate different points of view, not just tolerate them, but engage with them in a productive way. So I think the role of leaders in higher ed is absolutely central.
Great, thank you for that. Curious, Amna, if everyone kind of had that, and I'm returning a little bit to the faculty's role in this process. I think if everyone kind of had the same view as you did about modeling that kind of culture of free expression, I think there'd be a lot less work for FIRE to do. But I don't know how widely. I don't know how widely held that view is among the faculty. Not necessarily because I think a lot of them would disagree with it, but I think it just doesn't, so like in their training, in their, education, in the whole process of getting there, I think that tends just not to factor much. It just isn't something that they tend to give a lot of thought. Is that on base?
What doesn't factor much? Sorry, I'm just
in your professional training, I'll use an analogy here. Mm-hmm. My girlfriend is a lab scientist, or she was doing a postdoc for several years before moving to industry, and from looking at what it takes, say, to go from being a bench scientist to being a PI to running a lab at another institution, you go from being just a scientist to essentially having to run a business, and you really aren't given that kind of training. And I'm just kind of wondering, I think that faculty have, I think they have a strong role and a duty to kind of model that culture of free expression and create it in their classrooms. But I don't think they get much. I don't know if they get much by way of sort of preparing them for that role.
Right. So I would say, we don't get formal training in that way, but graduate seminars are all about disagreement and about kind of taking a piece of work and more often than not ripping it to shreds, seeing where the problems are, and then kind of using each other as sounding boards to kind of critique the piece. So I would say, even though we don't have any formal training in it, at least in the humanities, I can say that the bulk of what we do is disagree all the time. The trouble, I think, comes in, we can disagree with ideas and concepts, but I don't think we do a very good job of showing how faculty can disagree with each other on campus and still have healthy relationships. And that's not visible to students. And I don't think we do a great job of it either. Now, why we don't do a great job of it, in part, has to do with the culture of conformity that is very much settled in to academia. And sadly, if I was to point a finger to anyone and hold them accountable, it's people who have tenure. People who have tenure have kind of not spoken up when they need to be speaking up. Because really, tenure is not for job security. Tenure is to preserve academic freedom. And not just your academic freedom, the academic freedom of your students and of contingent faculty. And they have not done a very good job at pushing back and preserving that space and making sure that they model those ways of interaction and show how disagreement can be constructive.
Sure.
If I can jump in here, Peter, I think this question about graduate training is an extremely important one. We can look at survey evidence, like survey of Norris or Eric Kaufman. There's evidence that there is that a minority of faculty are willing to discriminate against those with different viewpoints in department culture, in peer review, in grant reviews. And so that's an important concern. And there's some survey evidence to suggest that those views are more common amongst younger scholars and graduate students. I do think being a graduate student is a moment of transition. And you are both a student and a scholar at the same time. So there's a lot of just mental back and forth. Every day you go from the classroom where you're a teaching assistant, where you have to maintain for yourself a kind of a neutral stance so that you can encourage your students to express whatever view they think, or even play the devil's advocate. And then you go to your graduate seminar where you vigorously defend, as Amna just described, your own point of view. So more than at any point in your career, you're making this mental back and forth between putting forward your own view and creating an environment in which others can present and debate views. So I'm encouraged that I see in the kind of professional and career seminars that are usually required in many graduate programs in the last year of study before people take their preliminary exams. An increasing number of these include academic freedom and freedom of expression as explicit topics. I think there should be, more discussion in graduate school about the importance of how to create an environment in your classroom, and how, as a scholar, academic freedom in your research, in the classroom setting, in your extracurricular statements are really essential to the work.
I've got one. Oh, sorry.
No, please, Robbie.
I've got one quick point that's somewhat related to the modeling efforts that you're describing. And it's a point that comes to mind. I believe it was mentioned in The Coddling of the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And it's a decrease in the response between faculty members of similar departments to say, like a piece that comes out by one particular faculty member that is widely criticized and is something that's fairly controversial. And there's a rise recently of the response to that, instead of being similar articles contradicting those claims and engaging with those claims, and that being replaced, that peer-reviewed empirical process being replaced by essentially petitions and signatures of people. And instead of engaging with it critically, it's just, we're going to shut this down with a quick signature. And I think that's one thing that needs to be modeled in particular, is that when we encounter ideas that are something that we disagree with profoundly, even in that sense, we take a step back. Someone was talking earlier about taking a breath. It's really important, at least that sometimes, maybe not in every case, but sometimes, that we engage with that critically as opposed to shutting it down. That was just something that came to mind earlier.
Yeah, I think this is an important question. Is retraction the new rebuttal? That's a question that I think is an important one.
Along those lines, and maybe Amna, here's where it comes back to you as a professor. Do you see scholarship suffering as a result of this, in terms of the quality of work that gets done, the process by which it gets reviewed, the adventurousness, of being willing to risk controversial positions?
I think for sure there is definitely a way in which, especially in the sciences, I think it's more prominent. Certain questions can no longer be asked because they're considered taboo and they will not be entertained. Now, let me just be clear, some of those questions, what is the point of asking them I do recognize that certain are more valuable than others, but there are ways in which questions are being shut down, and we're seeing them happen across the board. I mean, I think most recently is a Catherine Page's book on genetics that is causing a bit of a stir. You know, there are fewer people who are willing to ask those kinds of questions and what the implications of those questions will be. I think in fields like mine, which is history, yes, it's interesting to see how things become fashionable, and also to think about how, you know, how graduate advisors are turning people away from asking certain kind of questions, or not turning people away, that's not the right way to put it, but kind of suggesting what would be more fruitful questions to ask vis-a-vis getting a job. These are really important concerns, but the fact that these are factoring into how people choose to do their research and how they're being advised is indicative of trends that are limiting academic freedom.
Sure. I had a question, and it just I had a follow up, and it just exited my head as I was starting to verbalize it. Well, I'll do this. I see a question that's come in, and why don't we take a shot at it, because it's the reason why we're here after all. Question being, why do you think it's important for us to find common ground on these kinds of issues to begin with?
I'll jump in here.
Anyway, anyone can hop in on that.
I think both Robbie and Amna have said something important, that is in terms of polarization and the wide range of views that we have in our politics and our civil society. It's not that's in some ways a sign of health in our democracy. That isn't the problem. It's not polarization, but this what political scientists call affective polarization. And we really think people who are on the other side are bad people with bad values. And I think so what we need to find common ground on are ways for people to have conversations across difference. Higher ed has an essential role in teaching those skills. And there's more that can be done. Many campuses are working hard to do that. But I'm also concerned that it doesn't always happen. The perception gap came out, a report from the Hidden Tribes group a couple of years ago said that higher education sometimes makes people have even more extreme estimates of the number of people who are on the other side of the partisan aisle who hold extreme views. So there's some evidence that higher education isn't doing all that it can in order to help people learn why those who have different views hold those views, and how it is that we can have conversations. So there's more to be done in this area.
I remembered the question I was about to ask, and it was for you, Jackie, because one of the kind of shifts that I've seen maybe in the last year or two, when issues of racial justice and that entire set of concerns have become much more prominent and much more pressing on campuses, is that there has been a increased push from government, a lot of it at the state level, in getting involved and trying and asserting themselves on issues of whatever very loosely gets defined as critical race theory these days. That being one example, but it's something we're following. It's something that we're following closely at FIRE, because these bills, a lot of which are aimed at K-12 education, but some of which do have implications for our work in higher ed. We've talked about the roles of the students, the administrators, the faculty. Can you talk about this, from your perspective, as someone with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which has a lot of very notable politicians among its advisors. Can you speak to kind of the public policy response that we're seeing, and maybe talk about where it may be, where it may be onto something, where it may be going off the rails a little bit, given to excess?
Sure, I'm glad to speak to that. And the state bills that we see in about 20 states, there's tremendous variety amongst those bills and which ones apply to K-12 and also to higher ed. I think the most important thing to keep in mind when we look at higher education and issues of open inquiry and campus culture is that these are fundamentally issues for campus governance rather than for governance from the State House. These are issues that colleges and universities understand best, and that they are charged with maintaining a robust academic culture. And prescriptions about what can be taught or what must be taught are issues best determined by individual faculty members setting their own curricula, or campus curriculum committees setting standards for the campus. I do think that there been a lot of incidents, some of which are headline grabbing incidents that are not representative of what typically goes on a college campus, then people hear about these self-censorship concerns that students have on a more day-to-day basis. And that has eroded public support for higher education. In a recent survey, only about half of the people think that colleges and universities have a positive effect on the way things are going in this country. And that's a real concern. There's lots of reasons for that beyond the freedom of expression crisis. But I do think that's one reason why it's important for colleges and universities to do more and to be seen to do more about maintaining a campus culture of open inquiry so that we can rebuild public trust in these essential civic institutions that are colleges and universities.
Can I just come in there? I think, Jackie, you're picking up on something that is absolutely vital. And I think the survey you're referring to, 38%, if I'm remembering correctly, said higher ed has a negative impact on society. And that to me it's not just that it's neutral or doesn't impact, it's like negative. So the issue of public trust and how important it is for higher ed institutions at this moment to work on that, because that is really where the key battle is to regain that trust and show how essential higher education is for our society, our democratic institutions. So that's one thing. And the other thing I was going to say, Jackie, that you were mentioning about, that these are issues for governance at the level of what is to be taught and not taught is not something that needs, especially in higher education, is not something that can come by diktat from the top. These are issues where institutional governance matters. And over there, I'd like to point out that within an institutional, the governance is a faculty on these issues that matters the most. And COVID, according to the AAUP report that came out recently, faculty governance has taken a hit under COVID. And this is deeply detrimental to the ways in which curricula will be structured going forward and what are the kinds of issues that will be talked about. So I feel like we're facing many crises on multiple fronts. There's the kind of public perception crisis. There's the issue of faculty governance being undermined and what's going to be taught. And then there's the issue of higher ed leaders, the pressure that is on them to be seen to be pandering to certain interest groups, which is, again, not laying the kind of foundation for institutions to be modeling the kind of behavior they need to be modeling at this moment.
Thank you for that. Robbie, you're in a position, as a student trustee, as the student government leader, what you do, your work, a lot will say it reflects on the university. And I think you take that leadership role pretty seriously as a result. But you're going to college at a much different time than I was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I don't recall most state legislatures or a lot of congressmen particularly caring all all that much about what might have been going on my campus. And now sort of, everyone kind of has their opinions on that. And we've seen, there's more willingness to assert themselves at the state level. And I know in the University of North Carolina system, there's been a really active presence by the regions. There are the regions that really kind of take an active role, and then there are the ones that the more act as kind of rubber stamps, and the University of North Carolina system definitely seems to fall in the former column there. Can you talk from your perspective as a student leader on that balance you have to try and find in terms of maintaining the trust and credibility of the institution to the public?
Absolutely. I, again, have just a lot of thoughts on this topic in particular. One is that when I look at state legislatures and they're trying to meddle in these particular areas, my first thought is that I'm a little bit insulted as a student, is the idea that I, as someone who's engaging in this type of learning, am not able to engage with this material so much so that it needs to be blocked from me even encountering it. It is fundamentally something that I find insulting to my own abilities. As far as, I guess, engaging with it as an institution, again, just a lot of thoughts there. I speak pretty often with other student body presidents around the system, speak with trustees, other trustees. And one thing that took me a little bit of time to learn is that I truly believe that they mean well with what they're doing, at least in general. And I think that's an important piece to keep in mind, is that a lot of these individuals are doing their best, doing what they think is best for the institution. And they're looking at some of the outcomes that we're all concerned about, like student illiberalism, something that we find as likely a group something to be problematic, and top down they're thinking that this is the solution. And I think as an institution, what we need to respond with is that is in turn going to be a problematic aspect, that if we allow this kind of meddling from top down, if we undermine the institutional leadership, faculty governance and stuff, that's going to have down the line unintentional bad outcomes. And one of the things that I'm excited about is the potential of engaging with these individuals and offering them other solutions, and other solutions that I think are more sustainable and more in line with the health of the institution in the long term. So when I look at some of the material that I'm taught, even as a student, that I think is probably wrong, there's where I think there's reasonable minds can disagree. There's plenty of options that I'm able to engage with. I'm able to talk in class. I'm able to challenge things in that. I think that's probably the solution for all of this, though, is empowering students to respond. Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Again,
Peter, I'm interested in this question that we have in the
yes, and
chat.
I'm just going to get to it, the one we have outstanding, and thank you for your patience there. Jacki, this, given the role of campus leaders here, this one might be tailor-made for you, so feel free to give it a shot. And if I have anything to add from my perspective as a fire senior officer, I will do that as well.
Sure. Maybe just to read the question, I would love to build in the statements about the responsibility of leaders and bring up that across the US, Jewish students are terrified for their physical safety. This is, I think, a really important question. It's a time where we have seen an increasing number of anti-Semitic incidents, both on campus and off campus. And thinking about the campus setting, there's a couple very important considerations here. It's very important in an academic setting, and when we're in a public policy class or elsewhere on the campus, to be able to have frank and open discussions about the intractable Middle East issues in the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Those have to be being able to be openly and frankly discussed and debated. And this is another instance where we have seen at least one state law that seem to make it harder to have those conversations. But while we have to respect the ability to have those open and frank conversations, it's really important to have also respectful, safe environment for every student on campus and Jewish students on campus. So it's important for leaders to think about, ways to combat anti-Semitism. And I just think of a couple examples. There's a student government leader, I can't remember what her role was, who was felt pressured to resign her role. And Carol Folt, the president of that institution, brought out a powerful statement condemning anti-Semitism on a campus. Another private liberal arts college in the Northeast, and the student government, which on that campus had a role in conferring recognition on student government or student groups, had declined to recognize a pro-Israeli student group, and the president of that campus had to intervene to confer recognition on that group. So I think we see anti-Semitism, again, from very small numbers from the right and from the left, and it's really important for campus leaders to focus on this issue, both to allow frank and open discussion of issues in the Middle East, but also to make sure that the campus environment is safe and respectful for all students.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Sort of a question, and this can be for any or all of our panelists. Just keeping on the topic I was on earlier, just about how much more public awareness, public exposure there is of these campus free speech issues. How I think there's a lot to be said about how that has played a role in politicizing some of these conflicts further. I think there's an extent to which it can be, you can see the public policy response as a sort of backlash to what they see as, to what policymakers see as excesses of the campus community. I think we saw, from our position at FIRE, I can tell you last year in the handful of months after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, the number of inquiries and submissions that came into FIRE went off the charts, because any speech on kind of that canopy of issues became incredibly sensitive and incredibly fraught. And things have sort of cooled a little bit since then. We've sort of reverted to the mean in terms of our usual caseload, but it made for it made for a remarkable year. And I think around that time also is when the term cancel culture really started taking on. I think those two things are to an extent pretty connected. In this, what do you see as being necessary to kind of break this cycle of the excesses that you see on one side being met with the excesses you meet on the other side? How do we get through that?
That's a really tough one.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important, and this is only a small part of the solution, and it's the place where faculty, I think, have an important role, is to talk about how open discourse and freedom of speech and freedom of expression has, in our history as a country and a society, has advanced the interest of underrepresented groups and minority communities, that ultimately speech codes grow. And so whether we look at the civil rights era and John Lewis being arrested for a sign that said "one man, one vote," or the suffragettes being told that their speech was undermining the moral character of the American community, and police not protecting them when they marched in 1913 for the right to vote, or the Me Too movement, or Black Lives Matter. That free speech ultimately is a progressive force in our society, and it is used to redress injustice. And learning more about our history and the way in which speech and expression has been used to advance the interests of underrepresented groups and their status in our community. I think that is one important piece.
Can I just build on that? I think this moment where, extremes are reacting to the other extreme in the same coin, so to speak, using the same tactics, becoming more censorious as a way to deal with speech that they don't like, is a manifestation of deep historical ignorance and deep global ignorance. It doesn't take much, like Jackie is saying. We can learn so much about what free speech has enabled and who it has helped historically within the US. It's been there to protect the rights of minorities. And this is my beef with people on the left and liberals. Don't cede free speech to the right if they're claiming it as their value. No, it is a value that is all our values. It belongs to us all. And the second thing I think is it doesn't take much. You just need to look across the pond and look at the rest of the world to recognize what we have over here is worth holding on to. It's one of those things that is special, that is something that the rest of the world aspires to. So you can look at gross injustices that are being enacted in societies where free speech is not valued to recognize the value of what we have. So again, it's historical literacy and global literacy. These things go hand in hand, and we could do a hell of a lot more if we educated our students in these two realms.
I know in our own educational efforts, emphasizing those points has become increasingly important in demonstrating free expression's historical impact as a force for good, as a force for progressive change, as a way of persuading those in government to reform unjust policies that that disenfranchise whole populations. It's been essential. I know that is something that we have increasingly emphasized in our work educating the public about this, because I think there is that real lack of understanding of historical context for it. One thing I remember, one thing I'm proud of was helping write a comic, and I say write, not illustrate. I can't draw to save my life, but one of the things I'm proud of at FIRE is helping to author a comic on free expression that we market to high schoolers, that we make available to them for free. It's called Finding Your Voice, and that puts that contextualizes a number of arguments for free speech, including the historical ones, for a K-12 audience, and it's a work I'm really proud of. But yeah, it's something that we have. It's something that we have had to, that we've increasingly emphasized, and another way of looking, of coming at the point that Amna was making, is that we've seen this so many times. Quite often, the first people that are hit by speech restrictions, tend to be the minorities, that tend to be people in the minority population. They have a way of becoming just another way of the majority cementing its hold on the minority, when we're trying to go in the opposite direction. It's challenging. I'll tell you, I think kind of the biggest challenge I see from all of the issues we've been discussing, not just polarization, is that we are a civil liberties organization. We are kind of first and foremost an organization that defends the First Amendment, defends academic freedom. But a lot of what's going on today, a lot of the problems that we see on campuses in the wider dialogue, they are things that that civil libertarian organizations aren't necessarily the best equipped to stop. There isn't really a great civil libertarian solution to things like to trends like cancel culture. It doesn't it doesn't necessarily break any laws, if you have, 10,000 people all calling for one guy to be fired because of something they didn't like. It isn't something there is a particular legal response to, but it is something that nonetheless, it is confounding and is, not a positive force in our society. But that goes, I guess why I'm grateful to be able to have these kinds of conversations, because the answers aren't all to be found by throwing the First Amendment at it. To my horror and shock, this is something that has taken a little bit of time for me to internalize. We're nearly at time. I can't believe that. I can't believe I'm saying this.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
I mean, I think it's such an important point that, that First Amendment is so important for us as citizens to be able to live the lives that we want, to worship in one way or to not be people with no faith. And it's so important for our political society to be able to have a pluralistic society where we really get to debate what and how it is that we should govern ourselves. But as those who are in academic institutions, the First Amendment protects speech that is untrue. It protects plagiarism. It protects speech that demeans people. We have to go beyond that to be able to have speech that is robust, that seeks truth, that gives a real hearing to other people, so that we can prepare graduates to go out to the public square where the First Amendment is the operative standard. So it's so important to think, yes, we're going to be preparing students for the First Amendment, but really we need to go beyond the First Amendment to do that.
Can I offer one super quick? I know we're close to our end of our time. One of the points that came up earlier with the role of First Amendment rights for minorities. I think there's a role in countering polarization for disenfranchised groups as well. I think specifically of the implications of a society that really cancels people who don't use the perfect terminology in every instance, and the implications that has for people who don't always have contact with up-to-date preferred terminology. It specifically harms students and individuals from perhaps low-income households and students who have not had that same education access. For students and anyone listening to this, consider it part of your imperative to combat that specifically as a means for ensuring justice. And that's my spiel.
Amna, anything final from you before we're cut off?
I just emphasize, I'd love the fact that you guys at FIRE have been focusing on history as a way to highlight the importance of free speech. And I would urge you to look at, because I've heard people say, well, that was a different time. And I think maybe using examples that are globally happening now would be a way to counter that kind of conversation where we're seen as having progressed, whatever that means, and challenging those notions. So that's my 2 cents. And I've really enjoyed having this conversation. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And thank you to everyone at First Amendment Voice for hosting us. This 90 minutes absolutely flew by, just as I hoped it would, and as I expected from the quality of the conversation. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, we hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.